All right, hi everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the first of 6 science editing webinars from the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT. My name is Joshua Hatch and I'll be the host today. I'm a former Knight Science Journalism Fellow and the editor of the Knight Science Journalism Science Editing Handbook, which you're going to hear about more in a moment and upon which this webinar is based. These webinars are going to be held monthly, or the 6 of them will be held once a month on a variety of topics, and they're an extension of this recently published online science editing handbook, which you can find at ksjhandbook.org. I encourage you to visit, where you can read about the handbook online or download as a PDF. Hopefully it's a resource everybody will find useful to them. And that handbook has formed the basis of these webinars, including today's. I should say that both the handbook and this webinar series are made possible and made free to you thanks to support from the Kavli Foundation and the Howard Hughes Medical, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education, and are an outgrowth. Sorry, I'm managing a couple of things here at once. Are an outgrowth of several years-long set of Kavli-supported in-person science editing workshops. Excuse me. Go back here. So we're really pleased to be bringing this to a much bigger audience than we can do when we do these in person. And I want to give a huge thank you to Kavli and HHMI. I also want to thank everyone at the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT, which is hosting these webinars, and to SciCommX, which is helping to produce them. So today's webinar is going to run about 90 minutes. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our 3 terrific panelists, each of whom will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move swiftly into a Q&A session. We have here in Zoom the ability for you to pose questions and really want to have that kind of open dialogue. There's going to be a few times when we're going to have some poll questions for you to answer, so keep your eye open for those. If you want to live tweet the webinar, go to the next slide here. There we go. If you want to live tweet the webinar, you can do so using the hashtag KSJ Science Editing. You can also tag the panelists with their handles, which I've included here. And feel free to let others know they can follow along at the link on the screen at ksjhandbook.org/live. Or, sorry, that should say live. I'm going to change that. Live as we go, live on air. Okay, there you go. This webinar, so a few notes here. This webinar is being recorded. And we're going to post this webinar on the website ksjhandbook.org once it's over. And some of the presentations may be available on there as well. For those on Zoom, if you attend at least an hour, you'll receive a certificate of attendance. And we're also going to send around a survey after the webinar is complete, and look for that in your email, and please fill that out and give us feedback. And if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to sign up for the other webinars in the series. They can be found at ksjhandbook.org/webinar. So with that, I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists. So we have 3 tremendous science journalists whose work you've undoubtedly read, and I'm really grateful they've agreed to participate, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So first up is going to be Melinda Wenter-Moyer. Melinda is a visiting scholar at New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, a contributing editor at Scientific American, and a regular writer for the New York Times. She was a recipient of the 2019 Bricker Award for Science Writing and Medicine, and her work has been featured in Best American Science and Nature Writing 2020. Her writing has also taken first place in the American Society of Journalists and the Authors Annual Writing Award and the Awards for Excellence in Healthcare Reporting. She also wrote the handbook's chapter on sourcing. So she really is the driving force behind both that chapter and this webinar. After Melinda, we're going to hear from Roxanne Kimsey, independent science journalist based in Montreal, whose articles have appeared in publications such as The Economist, Wired Magazine, Nature, Scientific American, New Scientist, and the New York Times. So all the places where you want to read great science journalism. She has received wide recognition for her work, including the American Medical Writers Association's Walter C. Alvarez Award and multiple first-place awards from the Association of Healthcare Journalists. Her writing has been featured on television and radio programs such as CBS News, WNYC's On the Media, and Public Radio's Science Friday with Ira Flato. Roxanne has taught health reporting and science communication at Stony Brook University's Alan Alda Center and at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism in New York. And she's going to speak about creative ways to find new and interesting sources to enrich science reporting. And finally, our third panelist is Wu-Dan Yan. Wu-Dan lives in Seattle and is also an independent journalist covering science and society. Her work has appeared in California Sunday Magazine, Elemental, Harper's, MIT Technology Review, and National Geographic, The New Yorker, The New York Times. Oh my goodness, so many places. So pretty much she's going to be discussing how to ensure diversity in your sourcing. So that's enough for me. You're not here to hear from me, you're here to hear from them. So I'm going to turn it over now to Melinda. Melinda, take it away.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Joshua, for those lovely introductions. I am going to share some slides, so just bear with me for 1 second here while I do that. Okay. Let's see. Okay, hold on. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about finding and vetting science sources. And first, though, I want to talk about why sources are so important. And I think they really make or break science stories for so many reasons. I'm going to highlight 3. So first, sources are so important when we are writing and editing science stories because they help to interpret and contextualize the science that we're covering. So a lot of writers and editors who are covering science don't necessarily have expertise in the exact area of science they're covering. And so we don't necessarily know just how important or robust a particular finding might be. And that's what sources are so valuable for. They can give us the context that we need to figure out just how newsworthy a particular finding is. They know what came before it. They know how the finding relates to other similar research, and they can also help us assess the research design and the methods and tell us if there are any red flags, any concerns we should have, and even whether the particular finding that we're interested in is actually newsworthy, whether it's worth covering or not. Secondly, sources are so important, of course, for shaping and creating narratives and stories. I love having scientists as characters in my pieces because their stories of discovery can be so interesting. Their backstories can be so wonderful and rich. And of course, too, we love to feature, non-scientists who maybe are affected by science or affected by medicine. I feel like this year, especially, there have been so many opportunities, so many reasons to have real people in our stories who've been affected by COVID-19. And those stories are so important for bringing science to life. And then finally, I think sources are extremely important for bringing a kind of humanity to science. So I think, sometimes the public thinks of science as kind of an indifferent, like clinical endeavor that doesn't have, maybe it doesn't have the color that it does have. It's devoid of emotion. But of course, scientists are people too. And they bring to their work their perspectives, their histories, their biases as well. And, their desires, their needs, all of these things go into science as well. And so our sources can really help bring science to life for our audience. So I want here to illustrate why sources are so important. This, I'm not going to say where it was published, but this is a head and deck from a story that was published a few years ago. And it's a very kind of breathless coverage of a discovery. So you can see from the head, Scientists might have discovered a fifth force of nature, changing our whole view of the universe. If the scientists are correct, then the standard model of physics could be due a major revision. So this piece did not include any sources other than the press release upon which it was based. And if you read the piece, you can kind of tell that it's based on a press release, but there were no outside scientists that were at least quoted in this piece. And my guess is there were no outside scientists who were contacted for comments. And as it turns out, there's actually a much more interesting story that could have been told, that was told when a journalist actually talked to people about these findings. And so this piece appeared in Quanta magazine, and just full disclosure, my husband does work for Quanta. But this is a piece based on that same finding. Natalie Wolchover, who's a wonderful science journalist, wrote this. And she found, after talking with researchers about this particular discovery, that actually there was a really interesting backstory that raised some red flags, and in doing the interviews she did, she was able to tell a much more accurate story, and also actually a much more interesting story. So this just illustrates the power of good sourcing. So I want to talk a bit about places to find science sources, excuse me. And of course, Roxanne is also going to be talking about this, and actually, and Wuden as well, but I'm going to sort of give the introductory overview. And some of this might already, you might already know this, but I know we have a diverse audience, so I just want to cover all the bases here. So where can you find sources for your science stories? Obviously, if you're covering a particular study, then the authors of that study are excellent sources, very important sources to have. And I'll talk a bit more about these each in a minute. The reference sections of studies are often places I go to find relevant papers, and then I look up the authors of those papers to contact. Science databases, I will talk some about those, but PubMed being one, a big one that I use a lot. And public information officers, PR people, are very, very helpful for finding sources for stories as well. And then good old Google. I will talk a little bit about how to sort of tame Google and use it to find sources. Okay, so first, let's talk about finding the study authors on a paper, just very briefly. This is a paper, a very timely paper, actually. It was just published about blood clots after the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so these blue arrows point to some of the authors that I will often reach out to get comments on a paper, on their paper. And so the first author here is often somebody who has done a lot of the work, a lot of the research, a lot of the writing. And the last author I often reach out to as well. The last author is considered the senior author. Usually they're researchers who maybe run the lab that did this work, or they've overseen the research in some way. And a lot of studies will also list a corresponding author. Often that's the first or the last author, but down here, this other blue arrow here, this is, in this case, the corresponding author is this senior author. But what's great about the corresponding author, they just give you the email address usually of the person, and you can reach out to them. But in the case of, if I wanted to reach out to Nina Schultz and talk to her for this, I would Google her name and of course, double check her affiliation, and then hopefully be able to find her email address and contact her to talk to her. So the same study, here's the reference section that's at the back of the study. And I often spend a lot of time looking up the papers in the reference section. These are papers that this particular paper has referenced in their writing in this paper. And so the papers are generally very, very relevant. They often will, they will be papers that have covered similar issues in the past, or papers that describe the similar phenomena. And so I will often go through the reference sections and look up these particular papers, find out who the authors are, and reach out to the authors if it seems as though the authors of these other studies are going to have relevant expertise to comment on this paper. So it's really important not just to talk to the authors of a particular study you might be covering, but also to get outside commentary from researchers who have expertise in the topic. Which I will talk more about in a second too. So science databases, there are so many. I've listed some of the ones that I use, and some that actually I don't ever use, but PubMed is one I use a lot. PubMed is a database that is overseen by the NIH, and it contains biomedical studies for the most part. Web of Science, Scopus, you can basically Google all of these and you can gain access to parts of the database. Even if you don't have institutional access, you might just be able to read the abstracts of the studies, but those abstracts will have the names of authors, the names of the scientists involved in studies, and then you can go and Google them and get their contact info. Jstor Psycinfo is a really great science database for social sciences and psychology. IEEE Explore, I actually don't use much. I don't cover engineering and computer science, but this is another database. And the Directory of Open Access Journals is great because all of the papers are open access. You will be able to read the full papers. There are also databases for preprints, and preprints are studies that are not published yet. They have not yet been peer reviewed. So you want to be careful. You want to make sure to get lots of outside comment if you're going to cover a preprint. But these are some of the databases for preprints. Archive, which is for physics and math papers. Actually, I don't actually know. I think Archive might also list published papers as well. I don't use it very much. MedArchive for medicine, BioArchive for biological sciences, and SciArchive for social sciences. And these have become, I think, much more popular, especially MedArchive this year with COVID, with journalists wanting to cover findings as soon as they become available. But again, you do want to take some care when you're covering preprints. So I just briefly want to show you, I bet a lot of you have seen PubMed, have used PubMed, but when I'm looking for sources, this is how I use PubMed. So there's a search function up at the top. Sometimes I use the advanced search, which is really great, but often I just use the regular old search. And if I'm covering, say, that paper that I just showed you on thrombosis after AstraZeneca vaccination, I might look for papers that have been published on thrombosis after any kind of vaccination. So I will put in these two keywords and search, and these are the papers that come up immediately when you search. And so I think that actually this is the paper that I'm covering, and it comes up right away. There's another paper here, and it looks like the same issue of the New England Journal of Medicine that I would certainly want to look at. And I might also look at this paper and maybe contact some of these authors. Castelli GP might be a very good person to talk to for this particular piece, because it looks as though that researcher has published on this issue in the past. So that's how I might use PubMed to find sources for my story. And I also should say my chat, I don't know if I'm supposed to be monitoring my chat, but I'm not. I don't know how to pull it up.
That's okay.
Actually.
We'll interject as needed.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Public information officers, PR people, they're also really wonderful sources of information. I often reach out to PR people at hospitals and universities. I mean, all of these, when I'm working on a story, if I am not exactly sure who to talk to, but I have a guess that there are people at that institution who study this particular thing or who can help me. So there are PR, public information officers, people at hospitals, universities, nonprofits, of course, government, and there are independent PR firms as well that represent particular scientists or particular institutes as well. So these are also wonderful people who can help you find sources. And then Google, good old Google. So I will share a tip that I sometimes use. I think we all probably have our own ways of trying to rein in Google and figure out the right keywords to get the information we actually want. One thing I do so I often want to quote, I want to talk to sources who are at academic institutions or at hospitals. And I've found that one way to find those people is, in addition to using the keywords related to the topic I'm covering, like thrombosis and vaccination, I will put the word professor in the search box. And often that will help me find academic sources. And so here I Googled professor thrombosis vaccination, and these are all actually really great resources that I would check out. So there's a Nature news piece, it looks like, on this exact topic, and I might click on there. It's perfectly fine to read a piece and see that somebody's quoted who said something really great, and then reach out to them for your own piece. So I do that sometimes. And then the Science Media Center, which I think is I'm not sure it's a nonprofit or if it's affiliated with an academic center, but this has this Q&A with vaccine safety and thrombosis experts. I would definitely check that out. And as you can see, this is one of the reasons professor is useful. Professor Adam Finn, professor of pediatrics, is listed in this Q&A. That might be a great person for me to reach out to talk to. And also this Wall Street Journal article might be helpful. So there are different ways that you can use keywords to narrow down who you want, but I've found that professor often works really well for me. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what are some important things to consider. Once you've found possible people to talk to, how do you know who to trust, and how do you know who's really going to give you the information that's going to make your piece shine? So the first two things I want to talk about are the importance of specific expertise. So if I'm covering something related to heart disease, it's not enough for me to just find any old MD, a physician, to comment on my piece. I want to make sure I'm talking to an MD who has expertise in heart disease or whatever aspect of heart disease I'm interested in. And so it's just very important to narrow down to make sure that your source actually has knowledge and expertise in whatever particular thing you're covering. And related to that is, does the source also seem well respected? Do they collaborate with others in the field? Often I will look at their CV and see, have they been invited to speak at conferences? I will look at the papers they publish and see, are they often publishing just opinion pieces on their own? Are they instead working with others and publishing with others a lot? That's just an indicator of how of their standing in the field. And I'll look at their CV too, but it's important also to keep in mind what stage a particular researcher might be at in their career. So somebody who's young, an assistant professor, maybe who's just finished their postdoc, may not have a very long CV, but that doesn't mean that they're not good people to talk to. I often find actually postdocs and assistant professors to be incredibly helpful, and also have maybe a little more time sometimes, although not always. So I want to just, before I get into the next two, I want to unpack this expertise issue a little bit more. Okay. So this is a Twitter bio. I took out the name because I'm not here to shame anyone. This is a Twitter bio of somebody who has become very well known in terms of being quoted a lot in stories, appearing on CNN and other forms of media talking about COVID-19. And if you look at this person's Twitter bio, it like sparkles. It looks like this is the best person possibly to talk to about COVID-19 that you could imagine. An epidemiologist, a health economist, health policy and justice, affiliated with Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and actually has COVID updates in the Twitter bio, which implies I'm the person to talk to about COVID. And look at the follower count there, almost 500,000 Twitter followers. But if you go and you actually Google this person and you look at their institutional bio, you will find that this person is actually a nutritional epidemiologist, not an infectious disease epidemiologist. And yes, probably a great nutritional epidemiologist, but this person does not have specific expertise in infectious disease. And because of that, and I think this person means well, but some of the comments and some of the information that they have spread or shared about COVID-19 has not been accurate. And I know it's been quite frustrating for actual infectious disease epidemiologists who have had to then try to correct the record. So this is just an example of why it's important to drill down a little more. You might see a sparkling Twitter bio. You might get a PR pitch from somebody in PR that looks perfect, like a perfect fit for your story. But I encourage you to take an extra few minutes, Google them, look at their institutional web pages. Actually, if you Google this person, you'll also see that there have been articles written about the fact that this person does not have the expertise that you would want for somebody who comments on COVID-19 and on just all aspects of SARS-CoV-2. So just do that extra bit of homework. Have your reporters do that extra bit of homework, because it can be very helpful and make your piece a lot better. Another thing to consider, of course, is the source that you're considering talking to controversial in some way? And if they are, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't want to talk to them, but you do want to try to get some kind of understanding of why they're controversial. And it can be hard to do that, but I often find just asking other researchers in a field why this particular researcher is controversial and what they think of them, and sort of collecting information from other sources can be helpful. But there are different reasons, obviously, that people can be controversial. And some of these, I think, are red flags. Some of these are reasons not to speak to that person, and others aren't. So you kind of have to use your best judgment, as to whether a controversial source can still be a useful source. So sometimes they're controversial because they will promote themselves and their ideas, even when those ideas are not supported by the science. And that's generally, in my book, a reason not to talk to them, or not to quote them, or to at least take what they're saying with a grain of salt. They might also have a bad reputation due to their behavior, professional behavior or personal behavior. I have talked to sources before who have warned me about other sources who have been accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and that's information to obviously keep in mind when you are considering whether to use that source. It could also be, though, that a person is controversial for a more innocuous reason. Maybe they actually have great ideas, but they are pushing against established dogma in a field, where the dogma might actually not be correct, and maybe this newcomer has a fresh perspective, but might not be very well liked by those who are ingrained in the field and have and who don't like that perspective. So that could be another reason. And to me, if somebody fits in this category, they are good to talk to, and often very useful sources. And it could also be, this final one, unconventional in some other way. There could be some reason that this person is controversial, or perhaps not well loved, but for reasons that actually don't preclude you from using them as sources. I don't know, maybe they dress strangely. I don't know. But if you find that a source is controversial, just, if you can, try to get some information and try to understand why they are before you use them as sources. And finally, conflict of interest is a very important thing to consider when you're considering using sources. So you want to think through, are there any red flags that suggest that this source has a conflict of interest that might make them not a reliable source on this topic? And so what are the types of things that you might want to look for? There's more than just this, but these are some key ones. Maybe the source gets money from, or has consulted for companies or advocacy organizations, or have been on a speakers bureau. Often you can learn this by asking them, but also sometimes they will disclose potential conflicts of interest on their research papers, often in the back, I believe, although maybe sometimes on the first page as well, or in conference abstracts. A lot of conferences will ask sources to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. So those are always good to poke around in if you can. If a source is developing or selling products, that is another potential red flag that they might not be able to give a really unbiased perspective, if they're trying to make money from what they're saying. And in my chapter in the editing handbook, by the way, there are some more resources you can use that can help you discover whether sources have potential conflicts of interest. There's some great resources out there, actually, for cross-checking the names of sources, especially doctors. So those are important things to think about. And just very quickly, I'm probably pretty much out of time. Very quickly, just want to touch on false balance, which is an issue that relates to sourcing and is very important as well. So false balance, also called false equivalency, happens when journalists present an issue as being more balanced between two of those opposing viewpoints than the evidence supports. So this often arises in stories that cover controversies that exist still among the general public, even though the science on the issue is pretty clear cut. So areas where we might see false balance include climate change and childhood vaccine safety. Those are two that I see a lot. There are obviously a lot more than this. So if you're an editor, you just want to make sure that your writers are not equating ideas that may have different levels of merit. You want them to be representing perspectives that are proportional to whatever science they have behind them. And so this is one reason that you want to be a little bit careful with patient anecdotes. Patient anecdotes can be wonderful. I use them a lot. But if patient anecdotes are being framed as medical evidence, that can cause problems. And I'm going to just give you an example of what I mean. This piece in the Toronto Star was published in 2015 about it was basically profiling side effects that teen girls in Canada had believed that they experienced after they had been given Gardasil, the HPV vaccine. And this piece was actually retracted not long after. And the problem with this was very much a problem with false balance, where these patient anecdotes were presented. They were very powerful, but they were not balanced by the actual science that's been done on the safety of Gardasil. And also they were not balanced well by expert opinion. And so what it basically presented this idea that these patient anecdotes were medical evidence. And that's not true. It's very tricky to determine causality with side effects with vaccines. And after this was published, there were a lot of great pieces that discussed the problems with this piece and the problems of false balance. And I encourage you, if you're curious to read more about false balance, to read some of Julia Belluz's pieces in Vox. She covered this really, really well. And there's actually a lot of pieces that covered this well, but just keep false balance in mind. It's an issue that persists, and sourcing is, good sourcing and making sure you talk to experts, and the right experts can help to prevent that. So just to summarize, sources are super important, and journalists can find them in many places. We're going to talk about more in a minute with Roxanne and Wudan, but studies, databases, Google searches, asking scientists and PIOs for recommendations. I don't even think I said that before, but yes, ask scientist sources for other people you should talk to. That's another great way. And you want to really consider how relevant a source's expertise is, whether they seem well respected. If they're controversial, try to understand a little bit why, and be sure to look out for conflicts of interest. And again, be thinking about false balance. So thank you so much. I hope this was useful, and I will stop sharing my screen and turn this over.
Thanks, Melinda. That was great. And I know there's really great conversation happening in chat and also in the Q&A. And I'm super excited to see other people jumping in and answering questions. And really, you guys are having a conversation, which is just awesome. We're going to have questions at the end, but I do want to just pose a couple here. One is, there was a question here that it's scrolling around on me a little bit. Any tips on finding an external expert who has read the study to give their comments, especially on a tight deadline? And I think maybe you very quickly touched on it at the end about asking people to suggest others. Can you speak to that just very briefly?
Sure. Yes. I do often, when I talk to authors of studies, I will ask them who else I should talk to. I will also sometimes say, who should I talk to who might not have the same perspective as you? And that will often give me really great leads for people to talk to who might disagree with my source, but who are nevertheless, respected in the field. And I will often ask. I mean, in fact, I think every time I talk to a source, I say, who else should I be talking to? Because that's such a great question to ask. And I mean, in terms of covering studies on deadline, if I have an embargoed paper that I'm covering, I do sometimes reach out to outside experts and say, I have this embargoed paper. Would you be willing to look at it, making sure that you respect the embargo and comment on it for me? And very often sources will say yes, and they will help me that way, and they'll take a look at it in advance, and then we'll talk.
Great. And there's a couple other questions I know are real popular that are going to be addressed as we go. So I want to jump to this other one here. And I've seen some of your stories, Melinda, about where you wrote about, I'm going to get this wrong, but sort of freezing the heart or cold, putting, and one of the things that was, you started that out with, and you mentioned this patient anecdotes, and you talked about this person who was actually going through this. So one of the questions here is about finding patient anecdotes and how you find not the scientists, but these people with amazing backstories. Can you speak to that real quickly?
Sure. Yeah, it depends on the piece. Some are much harder than others. With that particular story that Joshua was referring to, this is a popular science story I wrote many years ago. I actually, I had to sort of retrospectively recreate what happened to this patient, or it's not retro, what's the word I'm looking for? After the fact, I basically interviewed her about retroactively. Thank you. And told the story of this patient, but I found her through the hospital PR team. They actually connected me with this patient. It was wonderful. And so again, I cannot speak highly enough of PR people can be so helpful when you're looking for patient anecdotes. But also I find, and I think actually Roxanne will probably be talking about this, but I find real people sometimes on social media, Facebook groups. I recently wrote a piece about long COVID or related to long COVID. And I found a really wonderful Facebook group full of people who were going through this. I mean, we're having symptoms, and I found a lot of people to talk to by joining that group, and of course being honest about who I was and saying, would anyone like to speak with me?
Terrific. Thank you so much. We'll hear more from you, some more questions later, but let's go ahead and turn it over to Roxanne. So Roxanne, you're up.
Hi. Sorry. Hi. Thank you, Josh, for the opportunity to talk on this topic of using social media. And some of those questions are definitely things I hope to talk about in this presentation. So, Melinda, your points about thrombosis and using PubMed were very salient. I've been doing the same thing this week. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen, which is this is only the third time I've done this. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, and it's in present mode. So hopefully you guys are seeing the screen. Yeah,
that's good.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about using social media to find great sources. Just a point about my past. In addition to being a science journalist covering COVID, I was a science editor for 12 years at Nature Medicine, and basically was helping journalists kind of find sources. So I respect that, not only is it important as journalists to find sources, but as editors, there's a role to kind of brainstorm about ways to find people that could be helpful for articles. So let me just kind of move this. Okay. So science writers, like Melinda was saying, we really need to find highly specialized sources. If you're reaching an infectious disease researcher, you kind of want to decide, is that the right person, or should you be talking to an evolutionary virologist? Of course, all these examples are kind of COVID related because that's what I've been focusing on. But you do want to think, is their discipline appropriate when you reach out to them? And are they familiar with the methods? So sometimes you might find, let's say, an infectious disease researcher who knows a lot about a virus, but they might not be familiar with the methods that you want some comment on. So you kind of have to parse it as you're going through. And as we were talking about, finding patients can be really important for especially health journalism. And so do you have to find somebody that has an ultra rare medical condition? How do you do that? These are some questions that I've kind of struggled with or thought a lot about as a health reporter and a science journalist. And let's just see if I can. So just as Melinda was talking about, these are some great ways that we traditionally have found sources. So for the first 15 years of my science journalism career, these are the main things I was using, and the only things I was using really was PubMed, my very favorite site in the whole world. Research paper references, as Melinda showed so beautifully, press releases, and especially even historical press releases. If you've got a topic that you want to find some sources on, but you're having trouble, you can go to a site like Eureka Alert and put some keywords in there and find some people to talk to. Patient advocacy groups have been a mainstay of my science journalism work. I've reached out to them a bunch. Professional societies, linked to what Melinda was saying about conferences, there's often a professional society that is linked to the topic that you're writing about. I've reached out to the American Cancer Society probably 10,000 times as a science journalist. So places like that can be a wonderful place to find sources. University media teams. And I also like to give a little shout out to clinicaltrials.gov. I've used it over the years, and I think it's a little underappreciated because you can find in the clinicaltrials.gov what other scientists are working on a drug or what scientists are working on a drug. They have the contact information for folks at the bottom of their trial identifier information stuff. So that's a wonderful way to find that. And there actually is a search function for maps in there. So if you want to find somebody working on a drug in a trial in your state, you can actually do that as well. Okay, so this is what I've been doing for a long time, is using these sources. Now, a new thing that's happened is using social media. So this is going to be an experiment, but Josh has going to help me do this poll thing. So just to get a kind of sense of who we all are as we've joined here today, I'm curious if people are currently using social media as a way to find sources. So it's a very basic question, either yes or no. And I'll just give people a second to answer that. Because I have another question for you, which is, if you do use social media to find sources, which one do you use the most? I've kind of put these in the order that I might say that I use the most, but please answer as you see fit. So are you using Twitter the most, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, another one like TikTok, Snapchat? I haven't joined TikTok or Snapchat yet, but perhaps if other people are using those as a way to find sources, I'll be convinced to do that. Okay, so so I'm going to talk through a few examples, and they're actually some of these examples are going to touch on finding patients as well as finding scientists. I really learn a tremendous amount from people who have the diseases that I'm writing about, and I would say that increases over time because there's so much education that they have done themselves and that they share with me, with all the caveats that Melinda mentioned in terms of like the false balance thing definitely still applies. So so this is an example from a few years ago, and I was reporting a story for Nature Medicine actually at the time on phenylketonuria, which some people might know of as PKU. It's a metabolic disorder where people don't metabolize the amino acid phenylalanine very well. So I was writing a story where I'd heard that people, so you're given medical foods that don't have this amino acid if you have this condition, so that you don't develop some of the cognitive issues that people develop if they are exposed to this amino acid. But unfortunately, insurance, I heard from a source, a scientist actually, hadn't been covering this for adults. So I wanted to find an adult with PKU who this was an important issue for. And that was a little hard. This was back again, like in 2004, 2005, sorry, 2014, 2015. And so what I did was, for the first time ever, I went to YouTube and I found this lovely young lady, Katie McGuire, and she was making some videos on YouTube to share her experience with PKU. And so with that in hand, I was able to kind of Google around to find how to reach her directly. But if it hadn't been for YouTube, I wouldn't have known Katie existed and Katie's story. So this was the first moment as a science journalist and health reporter that I realized YouTube could actually be a way to connect with sources. And this is the story that kind of resulted from my connecting with her. We actually met and had lunch together. I got to meet her mom as well. So what was kind of a YouTube video became a real life interaction. And you know, it's very cool to think that I had the opportunity to meet her and get to know her better. So not just for patients, but more and more I'm finding I use actually YouTube to reach scientists. And this man here, John Mascola, is at NIH. And if anyone has heard about the monoclonal antibodies that people can receive to protect themselves or to, I guess that's more on the cutting edge, but to treat COVID, John Mascola has been heavily involved in that, and actually also involved in the development of the science behind the Moderna shot. So if anyone listening has received that shot or is going to receive that shot, he had some hand in that. And so I was writing a piece for Wired, and I was trying to find sources on the antibody story for COVID, and I found that Dr. Mascola had written about this, had given a presentation on it at NIH. So I find that actually you can find sources on YouTube by searching topics, and the benefit is you can do some of that like pre-reporting before your conversation to speak with them, because they've kind of given a lecture of their work already there, so you can kind of get a sense of what they're saying. And And another bonus in that story was that I was having a really hard time visualizing the experiment that was being done to isolate, to find those antibodies that bind the SARS-CoV-2 virus that they could then scale up as a drug. And so people were explaining it to me, and I was like, I can't picture this machine. So this is actually on Vimeo, but there was a video actually showing the methodology. So for reporters like us who do science reporting, or editors that are trying to make a story really kind of come to life, YouTube is a great way to source your pieces in terms of like finding some of this methodology. So this is the final story that appeared in Wired. It was a feature on the antibody drugs. So just some take homes for about YouTube. It's a great way to find patient stories. If it's appropriate, like if you can't find their contact information right on that website, you can usually find it elsewhere online on using Google. It's a fantastic way to find scientific sources that have given lectures on something. All the things that Melinda has said about vetting people in terms of whether, just because somebody says they're an expert and gives a long lecture on YouTube, of course, does not make them a great source. So definitely vet as you're using that as a source tool. And one way to do that is to go check their name on PubMed. When I did that for John Mescaler, there were many papers he'd published. And again, like if you're like a person like me and needs to really see something in order to write about it and bring it to life, then YouTube can be a great way to increasingly do that for your science reporting. So then I've got a second example. I'm going to switch off of YouTube and talk about Facebook. Interestingly, it's a very similar example to what Melinda had been talking about. So I was, this is about like 8-9 months ago, I was writing a piece about people who kept testing positive for COVID, even though they had a positive PCR test, but then 60 days out, 90 days out, they were still positive. And it was kind of a mystery. But the problem is that it was a very rare thing that was happening. And as a reporter, it was so difficult to find somebody in that situation. So I did something kind of similar to what Melinda did. Instead of joining, I found there were a lot of long COVID groups. And instead of joining one, I messaged the moderators and I said, hey, would you mind posting this text saying I'm looking for somebody who has long COVID who might be in this situation where they keep testing positive for the virus, rather than just having the symptoms, still having that PCR test in addition, remaining positive. And they said, no problem, thanks, we'll post it and let you know. And then that same day, I met Natalie, and Natalie reached out to me, said, hey, I saw this on the Facebook group. I'm in this situation. I'd be happy to share my story with you. And so we talked. And this is, by the way, this is the Facebook group that I reached out to the moderators. As you can see, there's like more than 2,000 members. So definitely a lot of people were active in this group. And then I wrote, this is the story that came from that, which appeared in Elemental, and it did, obviously I spoke to a bunch of scientists. I also had Natalie's story in here, and it helped frame it in a way that made it not just about papers, but actually one person's struggle with, like, for her, it meant that not only was she testing positive, but she was living in the basement because her parents didn't want it. There was the separation they wanted to maintain until she didn't test positive anymore. So that was an important element that I think that the science wouldn't have really brought to life. So some points on Facebook: be conscientious that like people might not necessarily expect to hear from a reporter this way. So approach them with respect. And there are a ton of collective groups to tap into. Moderators are a wonderful resource, and direct message them to get hold of folks. So I've kind of come to the halfway point. Josh, if I run long, just like give me some kind of signal. So LinkedIn is, how do I put this? LinkedIn is not the most glamorous of social media websites, but that doesn't mean it's not a great one, especially for industry or for finding sources. Like if, let's say there's a pharmaceutical company that's in the news and you'd like to either help a reporter find a source, or you're a reporter, you'd like to find a source, you can use the people search, which is I don't know if you can see my cursor, but like on the top left there, you see I've chosen people, and just randomly I chose Pfizer. And here are a bunch of people who are people who have worked at Pfizer before or currently, especially if you're doing some kind of investigational story. This is a great way to find former employees potentially who might be more willing to speak about their experiences. So the people search is great. The other thing is, you might not know, I didn't know for a while, but there's something called LinkedIn for Journalists, and it's a training program where you get 12 months of LinkedIn Access Premium for free, which means that you can direct message people. Like you can send in-mail stuff and do a bunch of extra things, and as opposed to just kind of reaching out to a source and hoping that they're going to check their LinkedIn messages. There's more access to them. And their next, you have to do the training, but their next one is on March 18th. This one's applications are closed, but I did reach out to LinkedIn before today and said, is this program still providing journalists extra fancy tools within LinkedIn? And they said yes. And of course, for that hour that they give the training, they tell you all sorts of other fancy ways you can use LinkedIn to find sources. So just some recap on LinkedIn. Don't just connect with the source. Don't just press that connect button and like hope they'll connect with you and then, from there, pursue them. Make your message really to the point, just as an email that you would write a source saying, hey, I'd really like to talk to you. It's a great way to find people in industry. It's a great way to find former employees, and consider attending those seminars because they're useful. Okay, so I left this big one for kind of last, or almost last, because I've got a coda with Instagram. But I saw from that poll that a lot of people are using Twitter, and so am I. I want to say I used wearing blue to like commemorate it, but that's not actually true. So Twitter is a huge resource. One key tip that I would encourage people to do is, if you're reporting on a particular beat, make a list for yourself of people in that area who are sources, because when you go back to that, you'll just have them all there for you. And sometimes people will either have direct messages open, or their email address will be in their bio, or their lab address will be in their bio, and you can click on their lab address to get to their email address, because that's often on their lab address or lab website. So just like with LinkedIn, don't be scared to use the people function search in Twitter. I've used this daily almost. So I put in something like, I don't know, vaccines. Melinda, again, our searches here are overlapping. And so you can see, this is just a whole smattering of people. So all that stuff about vetting applies. But, I think it's hard for me to see if you can, I think Gabby might be the source there that is listed. You can find organizations that way, is my point. And organizations can be a great resource. So don't be scared of the people search. And okay, so this is kind of related to the question that got asked in between Melinda and my talk, which is, how do you find people who will comment on a paper? And in the past, up until like 2 years ago, I would do exactly what we were saying, which was, ask people who else might be able to comment on it, that might have some kind of might be following that field. But what I'm increasingly doing is I'm taking that link. I think this is the partner paper to the one that you used, Melinda. This is another New England Journal of Medicine paper that appeared in the last week on thrombotic thrombocytopenia. So you take the link from that URL and you drop it into Twitter and do kind of a reverse search. And that's what I've done here. So I've dropped in this stuff, and I've seen all these people that are kind of talking about this paper. And then what I do is I vet to see if they're people that would have some informed thing to say, and I reach out to them. But when I do this, what happens is I already know that they're conscious of this paper. And that's kind of a nice shortcut that I found. So just to recap, make lists of people, look at the lists of people, don't just make them. And look at the lists of people. I mean, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, that's something you can do. And it's sometimes a very fruitful one. And drop in that URL, do the reverse search, and be sure to apply all the things that Melinda talked about in terms of vetting people's credentials on Twitter. She used that wonderful example, and I definitely encourage people to do that. So the very last thing I'll say is just about Instagram. Just check time, hopefully not going too long. So I would never have thought that Instagram would be useful, but it is absolutely a tool that you can use in your science sourcing. So again, this is related to patients less than scientists, but again, I think that learning from patients and including them in specifically health reporting, health science stories is important. And I've done a lot of writing, not just about COVID this last year, but cystic fibrosis, which is a disease that affects the way your lungs function, and it's a very serious genetic disorder. And I connected with a bunch of patients through Instagram. Use hashtags. So use hashtags not just on Instagram searches for sources, but obviously in Twitter, if you've got like a particular thing that you want to find out who they're talking about, use a hashtag. Sometimes people, I've seen even journalists, and I think I've done this myself, will say, hey, med Twitter, hashtag med Twitter, I've got this question, and see what people say. So in this case, it was cystic fibrosis fighter. And James here is kind of a person who's advocating and very openly talking about his journey with cystic fibrosis. So just to recap, and actually a final after I've run through that very quickly, I'm curious, after listening to these examples, which social media tool are you now most likely to try for the first time in the next year to find sources? So I'm curious if I convinced you to try any of these. It could just be Twitter again, but if people want to weigh in on that. I didn't say anything about TikTok, but maybe Woodan or Melinda might have some fun things to say about that in the question and answer. So final points are supplement your traditional sourcing tools with social media. Social media can be a great way to find patients who are eager to share their experiences. And when searching on social media, look for those people searches, use hashtags, and finally vet so carefully. Thank you very much for listening to this long rant about sourcing with social media. And if you want to find me on social media, since I'm talking about it, you can find me there. So that is it.
Roxanne, thanks so much. I'm sharing the poll results, and you've convinced a lot of people to try LinkedIn and YouTube and
Great.
Instagram. So I think you've gotten people to open think about some alternatives. All right, I know we've got a lot of questions, and I promise we'll try and get to as many as we can. But before we go there, I know some of them are specifically on the topic that Woodan is talking about. So let's just go right into your talk, Woodan, and then we'll do questions at the end.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Josh. I'm gonna share my screen. Desktop one, share. It's gonna freak out, and then presentation mode. All right, so thanks everyone for sticking with us. I'm excited to talk about how to feature diverse voices in our stories. I think diversity is really important, and if anyone follows me on Twitter, they know that I'm almost always trying to find ways to elevate diverse voices. Josh introduced me as a writer who covers science and society, and I think a lot of societal stories can be science stories. Actually, I think there's a great resource on the Open Notebook of how to find the science story in everything. As a reporter, I cover a lot of stories about health justice and environmental justice. And so that justice angle, I think, is really fascinating, because usually the people who are affected are communities of color and create context around the science that is being done or the people who are studied. So I'm going to talk about, how to think about diversity in your stories, but also how to ensure you get diverse experts. So the first question I think we should address is, why should we even care to include diverse sources? As reporters, I think we have an obligation that our stories reflect reality, and the reality is that we live in a country and world that is incredibly diverse. So I think this goes to show why it's important to highlight diverse patient stories, diverse communities, etc. With regards to finding diverse experts, diversity in research generally helps maximize innovation and invigorate problem solving from the research end. There is rarely a hero story in science. It's usually incredibly collaborative. And I asked around to on Twitter, the social media that I use the most, why diverse sourcing matters. And, somebody raised the point that elevating diverse sources in news outlets makes others, whether it's donors or funders, notice them, and just making their research contributions recognized and elevated to public discourse is also really important, so other people can possibly find them. I mean, I have no idea who reads my stories. It's possible that, there are researchers looking for collaborators. And if there's a way for them to work with somebody else at a different institute working on adjacent research, that can be fruitful in that way. I wanted to include some notes on how I think about diversity, and intersectionality is a word that comes to mind. This is a term that's tossed around in a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces. But I wanted to include this quote from Ijeoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race. You can read that for yourself. I won't bore you with me reading it, but the point is diversity isn't just about racial diversity. It isn't just about gender diversity. Things like socioeconomic status can overlay with that, or gender and sexual identity can overlay with that. And, what this quote says is really fascinating is that these privileges and oppressions don't exist in a vacuum, and can compound each other, mitigate each other, cancel each other out, etc. And I think it's really important to think about all of this when considering what diversity is. I was having a conversation with a friend last night, and I said, highlighting, if you're writing a story about software engineering in some context, highlighting an East Asian or South Asian voice might not actually make the story diverse, because there are so many engineers who identify as such. So I think that, depending on the story that you're doing, it can be an interesting question to consider.
Dan, we're seeing presenter view. We're actually seeing your slides small. I don't know if there's anything.
Huh.
I know. Sorry to interrupt.
Let me use slideshow. That works? I just don't see my notes anymore. That's fine.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
So I always say that looking for diverse sources is a mindset. And actually, Josh, I had those polls. Would you mind pulling them up? I'd be curious to see if people are. So there are two questions. If you're a reporter, have you audited your stories for source diversity? And the second question is, if you're an editor, do you explicitly ask your reporters to look for diverse sources, I think.
All right, so we'll let this first one run for a moment and we'll post the second one.
Yeah, so like I was saying, I really think that prioritizing diversity in my reporting has been a mindset. I can talk about endless stories where I've sort of panicked. For instance, last year I was asked to profile Carrie Mullis, who is heralded as the father of PCR. And I was like, oh, a white man who came of age doing biochemistry in a time where a lot of white men were doing biochemistry. How can I immediately, find women or possible people of color to weigh in on the story? And that was challenging given the context, but it was still something, that I kind of put front and center. So the story wasn't dominated by, it wasn't about a white man, and it wasn't dominated by other sources who are also white men. And the other thing is, even though if you go into stories with this mindset, it's possible that you're not able to get a diversity of sources. Okay, it's very heartening to see that editors are looking for diverse sources from their reporters. I love that. Thanks, Josh. But I was saying that, sometimes it's not possible to find people who identify as BIPOC or a women in a male-dominated space. And I think that's okay, because again, that is a reflection of reality. I just think it's important that we make an effort to try. Okay, how to find diverse sources. The most successful way that I've done it is if I'm putting a call out to explicitly make a call. So if I'm doing it by Twitter, I will say, I am looking to speak with somebody of this expertise, a preference for women and people who identify as BIPOC. If gender identity is an important factor in what I want to elevate in my story, I will also include that in the call. I've also had really good luck working directly with university and research institutes, public information officers. And I've leaned on PIOs quite a bit over the last year reporting on the pandemic, but I think PIOs have very much understood the need for diversity. I think, and then I was gonna say, PubMed, by looking at the author list, sometimes I can discern, like maybe the senior author is somebody who is Caucasian, maybe there is a second author, maybe there are, say, I'm just making this up, two first authors, one of them is white, one of them is, they have a name that sounds Middle Eastern in some way, maybe try them first. So that's how I use PubMed and looking at the author list. I think directing emails from what I'm striving to get is a nicer way of filtering, because opening my DMs to calls on Twitter can just require more vetting. And frankly, any and all of Roxanne's methods are amazing, especially using Instagram and hashtags. And with all of this is caveated by the fact that y'all should vet your sources. Which is the most important part. I think finding a diverse source, it isn't just checking a box of like, do I have a diverse source, right? It's like, is there a diverse source who is credible, who is trustworthy, etc. The last thing that I didn't put on here that I've had good luck with is also just asking scientists who I have a really good rapport with if they know of other researchers in the space who are, non-white, for instance, or not a man, whatever my filters are, that they would recommend me to talk to. I just want to echo Melinda's point of asking that last question of who else should I talk to? And I just wouldn't be shy about saying, like, I have my eye out for BIPOC scientists. Who would you recommend? It can feel a little uncomfortable, but nobody's really gone against me on that or raised their eyebrows. And when they do, sometimes I say my editor is looking for it, which is, I would say 80% true. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to make this happen. And I saw a lot of questions in the Q&A too, so I'd be happy to address those. But that is all I had, I believe.
Terrific, thanks, Regan. So yeah, let's go into some of these questions, and I'm gonna, I'll skip over some that I think have already been answered. And for those of you who maybe don't have them up, I highly encourage you, because there's a great conversation going on in there as well as in the chat. So one question that came in, it's not specifically on diversity, but it says, I'd like to know if there are any tips on how budding journalists can convince scientists to be interviewed and share their knowledge. And this person says, it feels like, they may prefer to hear from people from bigger outlets, bigger networks, and other institutions. So if you're sort of more independent or from a smaller place, how do you encourage folks, sources to open up to you and be responsive to you?
I'm happy to give a perspective on that. Is that
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Okay, yeah,
Jump in.
so even though I've worked at organizations for a long time, when I, back in 2003, I was a freelance journalist, pretty straight out of college. And what I started doing then, which has worked pretty well for me, is not to like mention PubMed at every other sentence, because I think even back then it was like pretty new and not what it is today. But I would find a paper that person has published and put it pretty high up in that first paragraph of the email that I'm reaching out to somebody. And I do that. I did that today. I did that yesterday. I still do it, which is to say, I read this paper I saw this paper that you wrote. Sometimes you can't read the whole thing. And it really intrigues me because it's connected to this thing that I'm curious to work on. So you're really just like, no matter if you're a fancy publication or you're somebody who's got 2 articles you've written or 0 articles you've written, making that human connection with the scientist to say, I see that you've been interested in this and I'm curious, that can be really powerful.
Melinda, Dan, do you want to add anything? Or okay, so there's a question here. How do you check your independent expert isn't a former boss of one of the authors? They used to say it, but often it's difficult to check every detail of a person's resume. So what would you do in this case? Melinda, maybe I'll toss that to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can ask. I mean, I think, I don't think it's necessarily means you shouldn't talk to that person if they've worked together before. I think it's important context to have in your mind, and you might just, keep that in mind, that they might not be completely unbiased. But yes, I mean, sometimes you could say, have you collaborated together before? Have you worked together before, in order to get that information? I don't think anybody has ever really been upset that I've asked that before. I don't know if there's an easy way to do that though, through like searching or, I'm not sure about that. I've never tried to do that. Ooh, academic family tree, Roxanne says.
I've never used this for the purpose that you're describing, ever. I've just used it to like be curious about who's worked with whom and who's worked for whom. And actually, some scientists find this is kind of fun when you tell them about it. But you can actually use the academic family tree to see, if I recall, I just put the link in, I haven't used it in a while, who kind of worked for whom. And it goes back, like you can go back to like Hook or whoever like found cells or whatever. It goes deep.
That's great. Okay. And there's some other suggestions in the chat as well. So Karen Brown asks, do you ever feel sheepish using sources that you find from another reporter's story? Makes sense, but also feels like cheating. So what do you think of that? Dan, I'll toss that one over to you.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I'm looking for good sources, I do ask my colleagues if they might have spoken to somebody, especially if it's very niche. It does feel like cheating. And if that person has the expertise to weigh in on my story, why not? I think the question I always ask myself is, person X has already been elevated by reporter Y for outlet Z. Is there somebody else? Like, what are my other options? And how can I help the researchers level the playing field in that way? I think I was writing a story about COVID testing a while back, at-home COVID testing a while back, and there's one white man who gets quoted over and over and over again. And next to him are also, half a dozen white women who get quoted over and over and over again. I spoke to some of those people and they're very good speakers, and that's why they get quoted, but it's such a big space. Who else is out there? And who else can I help elevate? So that is, I think, it's just important to recognize that goes back to the first slide of my presentation of, we don't know who's reading our work. We don't know who's hearing about these different experts we quote. And I think it's kind of on us to help level that playing field for them too.
And Udan, there's another question here that I want to pose to you from GOT. It says, what are some good ways to ask sources about non-visible forms of diversity and keep track of that info? And I guess I want to add to that, do you look for opportunities to convey to the reader that these people may have non-obvious diverse elements to their character, to who they are? If you can speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, so I would first ask if that is relevant to the story. So if I were just doing, well, I don't do this. If I were just doing a single source new study research paper and I needed some outside voices, and I would prioritize, people who are not a white man, for instance. But if somebody comes into my DMs is a person of color and has a disability, is it worth mentioning? Like, why is that important to the story? It's probably not. Conversely, if I'm talking about, accessibility issues in a certain field of research, and I'm doing a profile of somebody who has overcome that, like that's when I think it's relevant to bring to light somebody's invisible elements, I think. So it is a matter of context and relevancy. Otherwise, that can lead the reader just throwing an off the cuff comment about somebody's more hidden ways that they are diverse, whether they are transgender or disabled or whatever. That can kind of be confusing for the reader. So I think we and our editors should be like, why is this important? Why is this important? Do we need to include it or not?
Great. There's a couple questions here that talk a little bit about, I think, sort of the international aspect of science and some of the issues that can come up there. And so let me pose these two. One's from Kata. Do you think it's important to talk to sources from non-English speaking countries when it comes to covering a story in a non-English speaking country? For example, you do a story in Colombia, you look for a Colombian source instead of the American scientists doing work there or collaborating with local researchers. And I want to add to this other one because I think it's connected. Olga asks, I write about Russian science, and editors often seem, frankly, unimpressed by Russian scientists as sources looking for US or otherwise Western sources. Yet those people do not speak Russian and often can't read the papers and know very little about the subject matter, so their comments are rarely helpful. What's the way around this? So this is a little bit about, I think, maybe another aspect of this diversity, and really open up to any of you about sort of these issues around maybe bias towards Western science or language issues that maybe limit who you talk to. Who would like to respond to that?
I can start. I did a story a few years ago at this point about some research that was coming out in Kazakhstan about so in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, they did a bunch of weapons testing, which is now the testing went downwind to what is now present day Northeast Kazakhstan. And so I was talking to those downwinders, other survivors, and in Kazakhstan, a research institute cropped up to basically study the health impacts. My editor asked me for diverse sources, at which point I was like, this is easy. My story takes place in Kazakhstan. A lot of the papers were not published in Cell, Science, Nature. And other Western researchers have also gone in to try and study the impacts, which separate parachute science. We can talk about that later. But there were my secondary sources of being like, since you've worked in this area, can you provide an outside opinion? And it was just a very long process of vetting, I think, and also just like caveating the research that was done. A lot of the Kazakh research papers had quite small sample sizes, fine p-values, but small sample sizes. And that's on my responsibility as a reporter to basically showcase. So those are the ways that I've dealt with it. Like, I don't want to discount the local research that's been done, because it's good that, scientists who are nationals of the country that you're reporting in are doing that work. But to express their findings accurately with caveats in the appropriate context and get outside sources. I mean, Roxanne and I have been on a few panels talking about preprints, and I think it's like the same thing of vetting these studies, vetting the sources, and giving context.
Terrific. Roxanne or Melinda, do you want to add anything to that?
I actually got my start in science writing abroad. Like, I was in Germany, and then I was living in Latvia and Estonia. And so I was living in Latvia, but I did some reporting in Estonia. And I have to say, with the caveat, those were tech stories I was doing more, so it wasn't as oriented towards papers. But I think what convinced the editors in the States to run the stories was the implications, or like how people were using the technology, was something that I highlighted in my pitch to them. And so it kind of connected the research to like an impact or an effect or something like that. And the other thing I would say is, if the scientists are publishing in a non-English language, maybe they're presenting at meetings, so you can kind of say this has been presented here, or maybe they know of other scientists that can comment to say that their work is important. And then when you're pitching the story, you can put those quotes from those independent sources to say, I'm familiar with this work and it's amazing, or something, whatever they say.
Terrific. Sushmita asks a question sort of on this topic as well of sort of diversity in sources. Sushmita, says, science is factual. How does one's identity change facts? Where does diversity actually play a role in the content of the article? I know you touched on it a little bit, but maybe more directly, we can sort of address that question. Udan, I probably would put that back to you again.
I've lost the question, so I'm trying to find it in the
Oh, that's
Q&A.
quite all right.
I
restate it.
I see this. How does one's
Yeah.
identity?
I think Yvonne's answer is a good one, but I didn't know if you wanted, maybe you could address it as well.
I think, one's identity can shape the way that somebody is going about a certain question or path of inquiry. This is not a well thought out response. Of course, it's on the record, but it's kind of what comes to mind. We ask questions based on our lived experiences. We work with other people based on our lived experiences. And I think that collaborative nature ties into how we do science. I don't think it necessarily changes the facts, but it provides context into how the science gets done. I'm coming from this because I just published a story about parachute science and conservation research. And I'm thinking about, people who are not white and are starting research programs in their home country and are collaborating with Western scientists, and how do all those different perspectives tie into the production of research, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming with this question. I'm really just thinking out loud, but I don't think one's identity changes facts, but the way that science gets done.
If I can add something, I mean, this makes me think of some of the coverage of COVID immunization, and there are facts about immunization rates and the effectiveness and so on. But obviously, the people taking up the vaccine is a very cultural, often has a cultural component to it. And so diversity is going to play a major role into why people are or are not taking the vaccine. And then the approaches, the public health approaches you may want to take to address concerns of different communities and so on. So that's one that comes to my mind as why diversity really matters. All right, I know we're coming on the end here, and my questions keep bouncing around. So give me 1 second here to look for a few more. And if others have seen things, by all means, feel free to chime in. You don't have to wait for me. Let's see here, sorry. One question, I remember what it is, but I don't see it in front of me, has to do with the degree of vetting that you all would apply to someone who's sharing their sort of personal backstory. So say a patient tells their story of going through the system or having some intervention. What degree of vetting do you apply to their story? Melinda, maybe I'll toss that one over to you.
Yeah, sure. It's tricky. It's because sometimes when interviewing patients, they may have gone through traumas, they may have had a very difficult experience that they're talking about, and yet I also need to be sure that I can trust that everything's accurate, so I often will start out an interview by sort of explaining the process of the reporting and saying, for whatever you're going to say, I might need some backup down the line. We have and I'll explain the fact checking process, and kind of what I don't want is to imply that, I don't trust what they're saying, but rather that it is a very important part of the process, the journalistic process, that we have, that we have everything checked and double checked, and that we want to ensure the accuracy. So yeah, I will often say, okay, so I might need, if you're comfortable sharing that your positive COVID test results, and the paperwork basically that shows that what you're telling me is true, and kind of frame it as part of this process rather than frame it as like, I'm not sure if I trust you and I need you to prove that you're trustworthy, right? And I've never really had a huge problem. Most people, and of course I say like, I'm not going to share this. This is just for internal purposes for, you know, vetting, or not vetting, but for, you know, to just,
Verifying.
yeah, sorry. There's a lot going on right now. My daughter just got taken to the hospital in the middle of this webinar. So she's fine, but I'm just all over the place right now. My brain is not working.
Clear to attendees. We told Melinda she needed to go. She could go, but her hero husband is taking care of it. So, but we'll hope she's okay. I want to call out something that Sari Carpenter put into the chat, sort of to that earlier question about, you know, why diversity, which I know, you know, has been talked about and most people here, I think, understood intuitively. She has a really good answer, which is one reason it's important to include diverse voices, I feel, is simply that we don't know all the ways that people's identities and lived experiences might influence their ways of thinking, approaching problems, and so on. Including a fuller range of voices just helps ensure that our stories are more complete and accurate representations of reality, not to mention that it's the right thing to do to include people from communities that have historically been overlooked. I think that was a really spot on comment. You know, I was, you know, as I was preparing for this and reading some of your past work of everybody, one story that jumped out at me was one that you had about stories of 5 people who have been through COVID. And of course, you know, that's something where you pick 5 very different, very interesting folks. And I think partly to Melinda, the point that you were making as well, when you're telling these sort of patient testimonials, or, you know, it's more on, let's call them civilians instead of the scientists. These are people who may not have long-standing relationships with. You're not necessarily building a long-standing source reporter relationship. So you have to build trust rather quickly, I would think. Do you have strategies that allow you to do that? And I think partly to your point a moment ago, Melinda, is, you know, you want to verify their information, but you also need them to trust you to share rather intimate details of their life. So I was wondering if you could both maybe touch on that very briefly in the last minute that we have left.
I mean, I personally think a lot of it is building and showing empathy from the moment you connect with this source. I am working on a story where I'm speaking with a lot of trauma survivors, and I mean, I just kind of start out by trying to tell them that I don't know, I will never know exactly what they've gone through, and they can share kind of as much as they're willing to share, and hold back as much as they want to, and that if anything I ask is too difficult for them, basically I just kind of try to show them that I want to be as flexible as they need, and that I'm really interested in their story, but I also don't want to push them too far. And it's kind of like all in the name of sort of showing that I care in a way, and of course I do, and helping them feel that, you know, I want to do, of course I have a story I want to write and I want to report, but at the same time, I want to protect them, and making that clear to them.
Dan, do you want to add anything to that? You get the final word here.
Oh, no pressure. Yeah, I think being really transparent and open with my sources has been critical. I always start off telling them what the story is about, the frame that I'm telling it through. And I ask them, you know, if they have any questions for me. Through the course of reporting, if sensitive details come up, one thing I always do at the end is just make sure that they're okay with me using their full name. We act in the interest of our sources, and whether it's, you know, elevating their profile as a scientist or protecting them as a source, we kind of have to do both. And I see myself in that position too. Like the New York Mag story you mentioned, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I thought about diversity really hard for that piece. And the Asian American woman I interviewed, you know, by the end of the interview, I kind of feared that by elevating her story, I was further making her a target. The very last question I asked, you know, before we hung up was like, is that still okay for me to include your full name? I can use a pseudonym. We can play through some options. What's most comfortable for you, and leaving that to the source. But yeah, so whether we are elevating somebody or protecting somebody, I think we just have to make that judgment call in real time, depending on the context and story.
Great. Well, listen, thank you, the three of you, Dan, Roxanne, Melinda. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to Saad. I really, I just want to thank everybody for participating and being a part of this. We have 5 more webinars to come on some different topics. You can sign up for them at ksjhandbook.org. The next one is May 20th, and that one is going to be covering the environment and climate change. So we're tackling the easy stuff first. And watch for a certificate of attendance and the survey, and I hope we'll come back next month. Thank you, everybody. Take care, stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.
I know.